On.
On. Okay. Good. So anyway, yesterday we was focusing on using the system, right, that we're developing. Today is going to be more about scoping your projects. So if you want to do a deployment of the FAIMS system, we're going to put you through a shortened version of what we've been going through with Jess and Andy for the last like 6 months about, if you want to use FAIMS to record data and you've got existing policies, procedures, forms, how to go from those forms and we're assuming most people using paper, the paper forms that then get digitized at some point into typically Excel spreadsheets, maybe ArcGIS, QGIS, something, a GIS system like that, and we want to move to a more digital workflow where more of your data is entered digitally. Now, how do you scope and design that to make our life as easy as possible, and to get your and make your own life easier, and to get your paper workflows moved as quickly as possible over? I mean, basically, this is what we'd like to. What we're going to do today is what we would like to be able to warn all of our sort of clients about, because the process of taking your paper forms and migrating them to digital it's tricky. I mean, data modeling is the thing. There are professionals who do nothing but data modeling and go around to, say, small businesses. The instructor that I had when I learned database design, which was a totally pragmatic thing for me, it was how I sort of paid for part of my HDR work in the United States, was to do database design and some web implemented databases for our department, for the Department of History at the University of Washington, because IT was very decentralized there. So if we wanted a web page for postgraduate applications to the department, we had to run it ourselves, and so we needed to build a database and do this. And the fellow who taught the course, I mean, his day job was or I guess his day job was teaching at the university. His night job was going around to small businesses and saying, okay, you've got whatever antiquated systems or ad hoc systems that you have, paper-based systems, and we want to move you to databases, and to improve your business. And a lot of times when that happened, it sort of compelled the businesses that he was working with to really do a review of all of their processes, because what you find, and I've run into this again recently, in that in our school they've just after some after years of trying, the faculty gave up on having a workload formula for the whole faculty, and instead that was devolved out to the schools, and we had to come up with a workload formula. So fine. Workload Working Party comes up with a formula, how much is an hour of tutorial worth, how much is an hour of lecture worth, how much is a publication worth, and how much is every service position in the school worth, blah, blah, this, okay. Then they came to me because I'm the only one that knows anything about Excel, and I'm being a little bit hard on my colleagues, but nobody else, was in a position to really design, what the system for doing this. And even though I admit that I was on the Workload Working Party and should have seen more of this coming, it was very difficult to actually take the parameters that the Workload Working Party came up with and put it into, and in this case, the prototype, we're going to move it to a database, but the prototype is in an Excel spreadsheet, because there are no sort of soft edges. There's no way that if somebody has an, it is slightly exceptional because they got this is what we call edge cases. If somebody has a fellowship that buys out part of their teaching or something like that that doesn't sort of fit easily into the parameters, then you either have to do theirs by hand, or your spreadsheet or later database becomes sort of increasingly complicated to handle all these edge cases. And what we found out was that about 30% of the department of the school was an edge case of some kind or another. And I finally got it that there's only one academic staff member that I have to do by hand because her situation is so strange. But there was a lot of frustration on the part of staff, on the part of the the leadership team in the school, all of this, because it's much more complicated than you'd think, taking a, in this case, a procedure like this and implementing it digitally, because there are, I don't know quite how else to put it other than there are no sort of gray areas. That there's a, you put data in, you get data out, and it's and when you want to handle an edge case, somebody who, think about people who have SSP, who take long service leave, who take sick leave for a certain amount of time, and all these things, impact their workload. You've got to work through all of those. People buy out their teaching. There's all sorts of things like that that can throw it, that you have to accommodate, and this makes for extremely complicated spreadsheets and somewhat complicated databases. So going from paper-based systems to digital systems often requires you to sort of really look at everything that you're doing, because all of the little things that you have once been writing in the margins of your notebooks, or the implicit knowledge that allows you to interpret the forms on your own project, we have to figure out how to encode that into your recording system so that you can get the data out of it. I mean, the whole point is for you to get the data out of it and be able to question the data and to address the problems that you that are in your research design, or that you need to address. We want to make sure that you can get out what you can get out, and often there's a lot of this implicit knowledge, marginal notes, that kind of thing. And we've tried to preserve some of that in the application, that yes, you can take annotations on everything, on most fields. And that's intended to work like a, like the margins of a notebook. But for you to get the data out that need to get out, we have to take as much of this implicit knowledge as we can and make it explicit. And get it actually into the data and structure the data properly, so that you're happy with the results in the end. This is something that I'm going to offer some initial ideas, and then for the rest of the day we'll do some combination. For much of the rest of the day, we'll do some combination of looking at some. If anybody brought any data that is problematic, that's in spreadsheets or whatever, we can work through sort of how you would clean that up. If there's not so much of that, then what I'd like to spend a lot of the day on is looking at Andy's sample processing flow, and see how we might model that, and at Jessica's survey. And actually, I think the survey is going to be easier. But Jessica's survey, recording system that she has now, and how and how we do that. And we're hoping that we get someplace so that we can actually use this then to write up the parameters that we can give to our developers. And this will be an illustration of at this stage of the FAIMS project. Now, stepping back for a second, at this stage of the FAIMS project, if you have a recording, I'd call it a recording workflow of medium to high complexity, it's probably best for you to come and work with us. We're also, if we remain as sort of overloaded as we are now, we're also going to start passing work off to a consulting company that is interested in doing implementations of our system as well. So we may send you to them if we keep getting as much, because we don't want you to have to everyone to have to wait for 6 months. But it is best to work with someone that's whether it's us or in future one of our partners who has the programming expertise to do it. To help you with the development of the actual implementation of the schema and the UI, so you can get it, and so that you can get a mobile application you're happy with. If you've got something very simple to do, then there is there's a do-it-yourself route that if anyone's interested in, we can talk about a little bit later. But I'd say that right now and in future, I think that way of producing modules is going to become more robust. In future, also, our library of modules, these as I mentioned yesterday, they're reusable. The definition documents are, the library of modules is going to get bigger. So it's more likely that we'll have something that you can more or less use off the shelf, or if you do need it changed, it's likely that the changes will be smaller than they are now, or the changes would take less time than it would to build something from scratch anyway. But what I'd like to do is by at the end of the day today, you at least know what you're getting yourself into if you want to develop something with us. So that's, I guess, the intro to what we're going to do today. What I'd like to do next, before I turn you loose, I mean, I can't train you in a morning to do I can't sort of introduce sort of all of the things that I think would be useful for people to know for data modeling. I'd say if you're interested in learning that, I was able to do it in a 6-week intensive class, to learn it is about, and I think that's about I mean, some people, like Brian go all the way through a master's degree, that largely in his case focused on this kind of, data modeling and then the actual systems that you use to get data structures the way that you want them. So it can be an open-ended thing, but I think you can get up to speed where you can competently design your own databases. And for 90-odd% of what you do, it's probably about a 6-week undertaking for those of you who are might be postgraduate students now and wanted to add this arrow to your quiver. But there are a few principles that I think I can introduce that'll be useful to keep in mind as we go forward with things. The first thing that I like to bring up, and Brian talks about this too when he's at workshops like this, is that most of us now are using Excel, and we're using this is flat data. It's not relational data. It's a single spreadsheet, right? That's got sort of an x-axis and a y-axis, column headers, row headers. This is what we're all familiar with. I don't want to stand up here and say that spreadsheets are worthless, because they're not. They have their purposes, but they're extremely limited, and because they're relatively easy to get off the ground and get started. They can become very complicated, as I've found out over the last year doing the workloads for our school. But they can become very complicated, but there's a low sort of barrier of entry. And so I think a lot of academics, not just archaeologists, but academics in general, overuse them. And I can give you two examples of this kind of overuse of spreadsheets that's from economics. About 2 years ago, there was an article that proved very influential, as in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund adjusted their policies based on this paper that purported to show that over the course of the economic crisis, the higher the level of your debt was, the worse your economy performed. And this was a challenge to traditional sort of Keynesian economics. It says you should spend lots of money, run up debt during a downturn to keep the downturn as shallow as possible. And they said no, it didn't work in the last recession. It turned out that they had not copied and pasted their formulas correctly in their Excel spreadsheet. I mean, they did make their data available at least. So much later, a postgraduate student looked at it and realized that they hadn't extended that they'd added lines to the bottom of a column, and their formulas weren't extended to include those. And when you included them, the effect was only like a third of what they said that it was, and it's not clear that it's outside of the range of statistical noise, And this is something that, that like I said, governments changed and international organizations changed policies based on this paper. More recently, you might have heard of the book Capital in the 21st Century by Piketty that's come out, and they're already talking about him for a Nobel Prize in economics and all this. He again, good citizen, he put up his data, right, full of Excel errors. Mm-hmm. And again, it's copy-paste errors with, between formulas, between cells. It's the ranges that formulas encompass. It's got a bunch of errors, and this may or may, it's not clear yet the extent to which this is going to, sort of, I don't think it's going to undermine all of his arguments or anything, but it's definitely sort of casting a bit of a shadow over it, as it comes out. The Financial Times in London found these errors when they were reviewing his data. So in one case it was a newspaper, in the other case it was a postgraduate student who found these Excel errors. And what to take away from this is that, spreadsheets are great for for relatively simple, quick and easy things with budgeting and other things like that. But they're very difficult to get right. And the last version, I spent like a week fixing this Excel spreadsheet for workloads, and I'd done one of the same things where I fixed a formula, it was working, and then but the formula needed to repeat across different across different rows, and I forgot to copy it after I fixed it, and there was an older formula in the previous one, but the formula is like 6 lines long because it's got a bunch of conditionals in it to handle all these edge cases, and I didn't notice because you can't just glance at it and see it until I started getting, people sending their workloads back into me and they're screwed up, and then I have to go find it. Spreadsheets are, as soon as they get to have any sort of level of complexity like this at all, they're very difficult to debug. The ways that you work in a spreadsheet where you manually sort of drag, out over cells to say these are the cells that need to be averaged or summed or whatever you're doing with them. It's very easy to omit like rows at the top and bottom, to accidentally grab the row next to yours as well as your row, to grab the right cells, but then insert new rows in slightly the wrong place so that the range doesn't grow to include the new inserted rows or columns. There's, there's lots of ways like this that can go wrong, and it can be very, it can be very difficult. Like even the little window at the top that shows your formula may not show your whole formula because you haven't expanded the window, and so you're glancing through the cells. Okay, it looks fine, but there's some change that you've made someplace in the second half of the formula that's not even showing up in the little window, and it's quite difficult to do. And just the fact that that if you've got 100 rows of data and you're tallying them at the end of the row, or you've got 30 columns of data and you're summarizing them at the bottom of the spreadsheet, you've got to have that formula in there in 30 different places. And if you change it in one place, then you've got to copy it into the others, and you forget to do that. You don't do it quite right. That there's a lot of code that's being, formulas in this case, that are being repeated around, and if you make an error in that, it's quite difficult to accommodate it. The other thing, so that's debugging spreadsheets is not easy, and even people, I mean, one assumes that Piketty, must have had several research assistants working with it. I mean, it's a massive book. It's 600 pages long, big research. It's his magnum opus. Top press publishes it. And he seems like a very rigorous economist, and so you think that he would have tried about as hard as anyone's going to try to get his data right, and he still couldn't quite get it right. So you can imagine the types of errors that we see frequently, that we have in our own spreadsheets when you're trying to do summary spreadsheets at 2 in the morning in the last week of a project, and and then you walk away, then you come back 6 months later and you start fiddling with them again. This can be quite prone to errors. Another thing that's sort of a problem, that's a bad habit that spreadsheets do, and I'm going to start drawing a few things to make a few points about ways to start thinking about data. Spreadsheets build sort of bad habits in some ways, and one of the things is that, and now, when you start thinking today, when we start looking at how do we turn Andy or Jess's workflows into into digital flow, how do we want to store the data, what should the data look like? One of the principles that I'd start with is that if your data changes, you shouldn't have to change the structure of the thing holding it, right? And what I mean by that is that if you have a spreadsheet, and spreadsheets, they're fine, they look like this, and you've got something you're trying to record here. So you've got let's say you've got a personnel record here of some kind, and so fine, you've got your first name, last name, and so now you start putting in phone numbers here. So somebody's got a home phone, fine. So then somebody has a cell phone or a mobile phone. All right. So now you have to start. You have a second phone number. and you think, okay, fine, I've got 2 phone numbers. Of course, the next person's going to come along and they're going to have an office phone, and then suddenly you have to insert a new row here, and it's called, you know, phone 3 or something like that. And every time, and no matter how many times this happens, you're always going to have somebody who, for whatever reason, okay, I'm in Europe half the year and I've got a European phone number, so you need another phone number for them. And every time that happens, you have to add a column, and that can, you know, mess up. If you, I mean, this is a trivial example, but if you think about it for like attributes of ceramics, that, okay, I want to do the fabric color in ceramics. Okay, so I've got a column for fabric color. And then you said, well, okay, I've got a piece here that's you know, that's been poorly fired. It's got different surface colors and core colors. So okay, now I got to do you know, core color. You know, say I've got to do interior surface color, exterior surface color, core color. And then I've got a really crummy piece, and it's got different colored margins, and so you end up with sort of interior surface, interior margin, core, exterior margin, exterior surface. You know, these things proliferate, right? And in a spreadsheet, every time you have to add something like that, you have to insert a new column. This can cause lots of problems, you know, down the road for data integrity, for other things, and you know, so one of the ways that you know that you've designed a database sort of correct, or anything that's holding data, whether we talk about spreadsheets at the beginning or databases later, it's that you don't have to actually change the structure that's holding the data when the data changes in ways that are predictable, like, you know, a repeating field. So if you're looking at a spreadsheet and you have repeating fields like this, that's the sign that something has gone deeply wrong already, and that you're going to have problems with it. So the way that we handle data like this is that we instead of having a single table, we go to a relational structure. So what we end up doing, let's call this a person ID here, we end up making what's essentially, you can think of it as another spreadsheet if you want, that's phone numbers. And it might have something called, like, you know, phone ID here, and person ID here, and then the number here. And what this allows you to do is, as new phone numbers are added, so this phone ID can just be a, you know, random number, whatever, or a sequential number, whatever you want. As somebody adds new numbers, you just add rows to the table instead of adding, like, having to add columns. So adding rows to the table, that's just adding more data. It's not changing the structure of the underlying table. So so if we've got, you know, John Smith up here, and his whoops, person ID should have gone up at the top. Well, it's too early in the morning, and I haven't had my second cup of coffee. So he's person 101. You just keep adding rows to this table that have his phone numbers. And if he has a European mobile phone and you need a 4th row, you just, you know, add another row, and this number here ties it back to this one here. This is called a, or if you want to know about it, this is called the primary key of a table, and this is called a foreign key. A foreign key lets you tie it back to another table. This is sometimes a big intellectual leap for people. I'm very used to it because I learned it when I was like 20 years old, but 22 maybe, and so it's sort of wired pretty deeply into my brain at this point. But does this make sense? The difference between, you know, having to keep changing the structure of data by adding new attributes, so to say a spreadsheet, as opposed to just being able to add new data but not change the structure of something. Are we mostly okay with that? Yeah, you look good.
Well, why wouldn't you just have it set up in a relational database where your person is, so it is John Smith's kind of, and then you've got home number, mobile number, you know, like, and have it set up that way rather than needing to give each person their own unique identifier.
So you mean that you want to do a table
Well, it wouldn't be like if you were in a relational database.
This is a relational database.
Because I used FileMaker Pro, so I
Yeah.
would have just, for my PhD, which is a long time ago, but, you know, so I just would have set up an interface where I had all the different attributes, if you know what I mean.
And this is
a dirty word.
Yeah, this is the problem with FileMaker Pro. What FileMaker Pro probably did, although I can't guarantee that this is what it did, is actually do what I've described here. And this is the problem with FileMaker Pro is that it hides the data structure from you. That it says, you know, their approach, which has been very successful, is to say, look, mere mortals can't possibly understand relational database design. Say if you want to use, if we just take a competing product, Microsoft Access, right? Access expects you to learn relational database design, and when I did my first database course, all of the examples were were done in Microsoft Access. And you know, there are problems with Microsoft Access as a database. You know, it can't have multiple. You know, it doesn't handle multiple users well. It doesn't deploy online well. It's dependent on a database file. It's sitting on a computer, and it's difficult to share with people. And you know, there are these sort of. It doesn't use sort of real SQL as the language as its query language. It uses sort of an abridged form of SQL. There are problems with it, but I think it's not a bad sort of gateway drug to data. You know, to data management and data design, because it forces you to learn what these structures are like. FileMaker, their business approach and approach to databases is that, you know, mere mortals can't possibly understand this. You make an interface that gathers the data that you want gathered, and it guesses what kind of data structure is going to work the best for that and hides that from you. And so you never really know what it's doing. I mean, I think in this example that it is actually making a relational. It would actually be making a relational database. I mean, I'm not sure what your form exactly, you know, looked like, but it's probably doing this. But you can never quite be sure how it's, you know, how it's doing. I'd like us to get to the point where we can at least sort of. That we start thinking about some of these things and we know them explicitly rather than letting a piece of software decide how to do these structures. And you know, and I guess that one of the first sort of heuristics I put up here for it where you can tell something is wrong or tell something is correct is that if you're adding, you know, columns to things, which constitute sort of a change of your. And does everybody kind of get this? That if you're working in a spreadsheet that's got attributes across the top, that adding a new column that's another attribute is a more serious change to the data than just adding a new record that's a new row. That makes sense. That adding records is fine. Adding attributes is a structural change. Once you get into databases like actual relational databases, like let's say you're working in Access, or that you're building a web front, you're working in MySQL and you're building a web front end for it. If you make a structural change, it forces you to do things like rebuild your interface, you know, so that you can accommodate that new one. And it's not, you know, it takes 3 minutes in Access to do that, but you still, if you make that kind of a change by adding a new column to an underlying table, it does then force you to change your queries, change your interface. Whereas adding new records, that's what databases do. You can add as many new records as you want, and it won't matter. So if you see repeating headers, or you're finding that you have to add new columns to something like a spreadsheet or a database, that's a sign of again, this is just a sort of heuristic. When we first started talking about doing this workshop, because this is a new thing that we're doing. We didn't do it at Flinders, but then it all came up. Then when we started actually working through the scoping of projects that they had, it all came up, and I realized I needed to do some kind of basic introduction to it. And when we first talked about it, I thought, okay, we're going to go through the first 3 normal forms of the database. This is database normalization. Databases, as we know, relational databases, as we know them today, originated in the late 60s, early 70s, and particularly from a guy named Cobb, like came up with the rules for a relational database, and this is in the context of one of the first things that it was used for was storing data from some of the early space missions, right? And this is in the early days of computers where, I mean, at that point, they're still using a lot of vacuum tubes and a lot of memory cores, which are, they look like a little washer. They got them down in size. My dad's a machinist, and he actually worked on one of the assembly lines that made these because he was working as a machinist for Bayer Aspirin at the time. And they used some of the same equipment that they used to stamp out pills. They used them to stamp iron dust into these little round washers. Then you run 2 wires through them, and by putting voltages across the wires, this is how you store things. And so memory was at a premium. Memory took up huge amounts of space, and computers were, they were just making the transition then from vacuum tubes to integrated to transistors and integrated circuits, and so computing's expensive, and they needed very, very efficient ways to store data, right, in the late 60s, early 70s. And in 1971, Cobb publishes this book where he goes through the ways that you normalize data, and it's still, this is still the way that relational databases are. It's been the ways you structure data, it's been refined since then, but it's essentially it's essentially the same. And they arose in a time when you really needed to make the most of your memory and make the most of your processing power, and so you needed to store data in as compact a way as you could, and in ways that was easy to query and was and was put as little strain as possible on the hardware. So these guidelines that he came up with, or normalization rules, still produce very sort of elegant data storage, and they're still used now. And every few years, somebody comes up with a different way of storing data, like a graph database or XML databases or these sorts of things. And and in the end, it seems like they all end up in sort of serving niche purposes. And every few years, somebody also comes along, like Google's the last one to do this, saying, computing power is cheap, memory is cheap, we don't need to do this to data, we'll just store data in giant tables and just throw computing power at it. And these sorts of approaches have their place, but as time goes on, they end up often in sort of doing niches of data management, but the bulk of data, the heavy lifting of data management still tends to be in relational databases. I mean, here we are 40-odd years later, and it's really sort of stood up. But we decided to spare you actually going through like the first 3 normal forms, and this is how it works. And we're trying to approach it through sort of heuristic approaches like this, where you sort of see things that may be a problem, right? Like, and the first problem I'd point out is sort of like repeating column headers is probably a sign that something has gone wrong, and we need to split things out into another table. And it doesn't matter right now, as far as I'm concerned, that how do I split it into another table, or what's the underlying software doing, or anything like that. But just the fact that this shows that there may be a problem in the way that you're conceiving of data, and that you need to take something like fabric. If we're doing the ceramics example, fabric color needs to go off into its own table. The same thing might go for I don't work with lithics that much. All my examples are going to be from ceramics, or surface survey or excavation or something like that. But you do the same thing if you had decorative motifs on ceramics. If you start out with thinking that every pot's only going to have one motif, and you have a column and a spreadsheet for it, the next thing you find out is that no, actually, here's a pot that's got 2, and then the next pot's going to have 3, and again, it shows you that the decorative motif is probably going to have to go off onto its own table as well. So, this is one way of, if you start seeing things that are attributes that are repeating, we probably need to separate them out. I realize that I may need to review just a little bit of vocabulary to make sure that we're all on the same page with this. This is a table, right? It looks like an Excel, like one table looks like a spreadsheet. It's columns and rows, and you add new rows to add records to it. Query is a term we use in databases. If I want to look at this and say, give me all the phone numbers for John Smith or for Sue Roberts or whatever, that's a query. A query is a question you ask of the database, and that can be quite sophisticated. And this is where we get to an advantage over. At the beginning, I said that I gave those two examples from economics where formulas got screwed up, partly because formulas are copied and pasted across dozens, hundreds of cells in an Excel spreadsheet. All of those formulas that you would copy into, to do a summary, to do a sum or an average or a median or whatever you're doing, some kind of mathematical operation. In a database, that's one line of code that's queried, right? That says, I know these are numeric examples, but take if I want to know what my total payroll is, and there's a column over here for this person that's got his pay rate, and you've got a column here, and so I want to sum that. I just write a single line of code that says sum this column. So I only have to get it right once. I don't have to get it right in 30 different cells or something like that. If I've got a formula that I'm cutting and pasting across a bunch of cells in a spreadsheet. So this is one. Being able to query data like that is a very powerful thing. The tables and the queries together are often called. This is what's referred to as the back end of a database. That's the part that actually, where the data lives and the operations that you run on the data. The front end, what's often referred to as the front end of the database, are the forms where you put in, where you actually enter the data, or reports where where usually based on queries, you get some kind of an analysis of the data. So this is why, like yesterday, came, Andy's using Access. If Andy wants to step up his game in this regard, one thing that you can do is take the back end of the database, the tables and the queries, put it on Microsoft SQL Server, and then continue to use Access for the front end. And that's that front end, back end distinction. So your forms are in Access, reports can be in Access, but the tables and the queries live in SQL Server. And there's a graphic user interface for SQL Server that is not really any harder to use than Access is. That I saw some blank looks, and so I thought I should go over that terminology of what's a query. I mean, table I think is pretty straightforward, but query, front end, back end, these are all sort of database terms. So on on the FAIMS mobile application, the data schema is in its own XML document that you feed in separately from the UI schema, because the data schema defines the back end, the tables, and the UI schema defines the front end, the forms, and those two things are separate from one another. And this is no matter what kind of database you were using, or what architecture of databases you're using. This is a common sort of overall distinction. Let me think. I don't want to take up too much more time on this. Penny and Adela made me promise not to go more than 45 minutes on these things. I will give you a few other. Again, these are just heuristics. We decided it would not be good for any of us to again sort of formally go through the different how you normalize a database. But a few other things are. Other things you don't want in a database, and these again are quite easy to do. I have to deal with these all the time. I would, for this workload, that project that I'm working on at UNSW now, I would like to be able to go read in automatically all of the courses that someone is teaching, so they don't have to type them in by hand, because they have to type in a little code, arts 1270 or arts 2283 or whatever. Oh, maybe a third of the spreadsheets have an error in the academic staff who's taught a course for the last 20 years can't type in that code. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but transposing numbers is really, really common. I've turned lots of things into drop downs, but there are limits to what I can do there. and I'd like to just be, the office keeps a term planning spreadsheet that says in session 2, this is who's convening this class, this is who's, and maybe it doesn't have all of the tutoring information or whatever, but I'd like to be able to read that in. I can't read it in because it has a problem where, you know, they were putting this data in the spreadsheet, and their primary concern of putting this data in the spreadsheet was for it to be human readable. They want to be able to, this office staff, professional staff in the school want to be able to look at the spreadsheet and see what they need to see. And so it has things in it like that would be the equivalent of this translated into the example that I have here. They've put you know, all you know, phone numbers into, you know, there, and then there'll be sometimes a slash, sometimes a comma, and then the next you know, phone number goes in here, you know, and they've got, you know, and they're all in the same cell in the database. Sorry, in the spreadsheet. You don't want this. You want each piece of data to be what they call atomic. You don't want to, you know, you don't want to have things combined. I just by habit I put first name and last name into separate columns on here, but you often see sort of first name last name together, and I can, you know, if you there'll always be a reason you need those separate in some way, so that would be kind of another example where you probably don't want name all in one, but a better one is like with phone numbers, or you could, if you look at we were in a big rush one year when we were doing our ceramics processing, and we decided we just don't have time to set up any kind of database or anything like that, and so we put it into a spreadsheet, but only for, you know, human readable, you know, thing, and there's a lot of problems like this with it, and just because we just ran out of time, and we didn't have such a huge volume of ceramics from that particular season. We made a surface survey, and we only had the diagnostic pieces from a season that wasn't that productive, and we realized that it would be better not to burn our time out in the field doing, you know, setting up a database for it, and that it would just be better to, you know, write it up in a way that was human readable and get it into a proper format later. And it was, and we're going to have to retype it all. I mean, when you start getting too many problems like this, or another thing that was on that of course on any given potsherd we couldn't fit everything on one line, so we'd say that we've got, you know, potsherd inventory 1, 2, 1, 3 here, and then it took like sort of several lines to do it, and then, you know, there was nothing in this column. It was just, okay, this is potsherd. All of these like 3 rows have to do with this potsherd. That's blatantly obvious to a human being looking at it. A computer can't do anything with that. You know, it's it doesn't know what to do with these extra, you know, rows that don't have a number. And you can copy them down, but then it assumes that sort of each row is somehow it assumes each row is a cohesive unit. And if I've, you know, started with, you know, if this is everything about decoration here in this column, and then in this column it's everything about, you know, fabrics, and it's going down here, that this and this, they don't have anything really to do with one another necessarily, or there's no reason that this row about the fabric is tied to this information about decoration. You know, that these are independent of one another, and what you want is everything that's in any given row, everything in that row needs to be related. It needs to be a coherent, you know, sort of unit of information where everything in that row has to do with everything else in that row, and that's, you know, this is a sign that, you know, I need a decoration table and I need a fabric table, and they should be tied independently to this, you know, to this identifier here. So, you know, seeing, you know, lots of, in your main table, I mean, I'm not talking about in a subsidiary related table, but if you've got sort of one giant, you know, table, and you start seeing a row repeated many times with sort of unassociated pieces of information going into each row, stuff that's about decoration and fabric and shape. I mean, in ceramics, you know, we often have a shape typology or a shape, a fabric, and a decoration, you know, as our main things that we're looking at. And, you can have one kind of fabric may have, a number of types of decorations associated with it. Like they may make lots of different kinds of pots out of this particular fabric, and it can have, those pots may have lots of different kinds of shapes. That it's not that there's a single fabric tied to a single shape, but those are two sort of independent variables about the pot, or the shape and the fabric, and the decoration is probably a third one. The same decoration may be used on different shapes, and vice versa. The same shape may have different kinds of decorations on it. Same thing with fabric. Those things they're not intrinsically connected to one another, so they shouldn't go in the same row. One, atomic values in a row, in a single cell. Don't put like a bunch of telephone numbers in one, or a bunch of attributes of any kind in one cell separated by columns or semicolons or whatever. That particular one is relatively easy to fix and can be fixed relatively automatically, unless you do like, some of the data that I've seen where you're not consistent in the separator. Sometimes it's a comma, sometimes it's a slash, sometimes it's a space. That gets harder to deal with, and it's something that it's sort of the first thing we fix if we get a spreadsheet that has multiple values in a single cell. So no multiple values in a single cell, no repeating column headers, no putting things that aren't intrinsically related to one another in a single row. That if you've got these things that are clearly sort of independent of one another, like shape, fabric, and decoration, or are related in very complex ways that we may have to find out through analysis after the fact. It's best if those things go off into their own tables. And I guess I'll say that I do want to turn us loose and actually work through some of these problems. That's most of the first three normal forms that we've actually covered, I hope, in a way that's relatively painless, because I'm trying to do it through these heuristics instead of by starting with the rules themselves. But our database isn't structured exactly like this, but this is still, if you can think about your data this way, and I guess I wouldn't really I wouldn't really recommend like getting on Wikipedia or something and looking up the first three normal forms. You're going to get kind of overwhelmed by what they do have some useful examples, but I think they're only useful. Like I have to sit and look at them for 10 minutes to get it to click in my head. I think it's not going to be very accessible to to someone who hasn't. It's not bad as a memory refresher, but I wouldn't want to learn that way.
But is it not an accessible, some kind of database and for dummies type thing? I mean, not necessarily a particular publication series, but a very, very introductory level. I mean, have you got anything like that?
I haven't found one that I'm real happy with.
Yeah.
They're either like really, really dumbed down, or I'm having trouble finding one.
Yeah.
That's actually something that the four of us who are on this project have been thinking about, is that sometime when when we've got a hiatus in the project, we need to write a data modeling for archaeologists, data modeling and management in the in the 21st century sort of book for archaeologists that talks about the tools that are available, how to think about your data, and tries to explain it in a way that's reasonably accessible. Because this is a particular way of thinking. It's like learning a foreign language, or learning statistics, or learning learning a programming language, or something. That thinking about data in this way is it's sort of their habits of mind that you develop to do it, and it's not something that again, it doesn't. I think you can get to where you need to be, and in a single semester course about data modeling, or an intensive course that's I mean, when I said I was in a 6-week course, it was like 4 hours twice a week or something, that we went to, and that was how to use Access as well. They started, the first half of the course was data modeling, and the second half was sort of advanced techniques in Access. But it's it is a different way of thinking, and I'm partly asking you today to take my word for it, that I'm not going into a lot of detail about sort of why you need to do things this way, other than saying that it's going to cause problems for you later if you don't. And you'll have to forgive me for that, but I don't think we need to go into that background too much yet. Yeah.
I have a problem just with that example of your ceramics. Getting those attributes like the shape, the decoration, and the fabric.
Mm-hmm.
And if your question was, is there any relationship between, say, each pot? So each pot's an individual item.
Each pot is it? Yes.
Yeah. So it's in the row heading. And then you want to investigate. So your question was, how are these pots related? And they could be from several sides. Is there any relationship between anything about the pot? So you do a principal components analysis. So you need those attributes to be across the rows, all of them related, just to ask that single question. Sure, when you want to ask other questions, you change your table and you delete certain attributes that you don't want to question. But
yeah,
initially,
you don't have to do that. If your data is in a database, you can run a query that pulls out the data that you need across whatever tables you need it from, and it will pull out the query. Reshapes the data. In fact, in SQL Server, queries are called views, because a query lets you take the underlying data and pull it out in the way that you want it. So you may have data, like I may have, let's just do the quick, so this is your basic ceramics one, you've got your pot ID and maybe some basic information, inventory information, whatever, and then you might use, so you'd have in fact I won't draw the actual table, I will draw a diagram instead. That you've got sort of your basic table here, then you've got your pottery there, you might have shape, fabric, decoration, and these are in their own tables that are related to your table. You can run based on this pot ID, which appears in each row of all of these tables. This is pottery, and one row in this table is an identifier, right? This identifier in this table appears in all these other tables, so it relates the. You can look up, if you've got pot number 1001, you can query these three tables and get the shape, all the shape information, all the fabric information, and all the decoration information pulled out about that pot, right? And you can do that through a query, and then you can take the results of that query and run whatever statistics that you want on it. And this is getting more and more powerful in systems like you can take Postgres is a very powerful. It's a database. Damien works in it a lot, and you can integrate the statistics package R into Postgres, and you can do fantastic things with it. And you don't have to sort of delete columns, rearrange things, copy data. You've got your data living in these multiple tables, and you say that I want to run an analysis to see if this kind of shape, this kind of fabric, and this kind of decoration appear together, or run the statistics like what you're saying to see what shapes, fabrics, and decorations occur in an assemblage together. That you want to learn those things. You can query this data, pull it out, and then run those analyses on it. And it doesn't require sort of, like you were saying.
So you can query that by getting all the pots. And if you started off with this thing, doing separate tables and everything for each of those attributes, then you can actually tie them all together by writing a script that says tie it all together, get all your pots together, and run this analysis.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take too long.
No, I mean the SQL is the language that you use to write these queries. That's why everything is called MySQL, SQL Server, whatever. SQL is the language.
How long does it take to learn that language?
Well, in Access you can just do it automatically. Query Wizard. and collect the ones you want, and in 10 seconds you got it.
There is also a graphic user interface for instance, for SQL Server. There are, I have worked less in MySQL than I have in SQL Server, but there's also sort of graphic user interfaces for that as well. Penny's been playing with a SQLite's the
SQLite browser and just copying and pasting SQL strings into the search view. And the other thing is you can save the query or the view, so you don't need to write that script every time. You write it the first time, you save it, and each time you come back, you can look at that query or view.
And SQL is not a particularly, it's not like, learning Python or, Python is often used as an example of a relatively easy programming language to learn, and SQL is definitely, like, significantly easier.
Is it easier than SPSS, where you have to learn?
It's probably about the same as using R or SPSS. It would be, I'd say that's a similar level. But again, there are graphic user interfaces that you can use to help you build queries, where you can sort of drag and drop fields into a query builder and do that, and you don't have to know it. And I probably used Access for 6 or 9 months before I finally got to a point where I was forced to write some of my own SQL because the built-in query builders broke when I was doing things that involved too many tables and too many layers of depth. Often these go further down. That for Fabric you're dealing with color inclusions. Inclusions have to go in there. Always end up going into their own table because they can be very complicated if you're tracking them. If you want to work with dating or provenience of the things, you often have to work with these. I'm sure if you've done Fabrics, you know about these things. I did one of the first archaeological databases I built was a Fabric database, and it took about 21 or 22 tables to get it all normalized and working properly, and then it worked quite well. But it was, and some of the tables were just lookup tables where I kept lists of, these are the control, these are the, if you're describing a shape, these are the terms you can use. So it's not quite. If I eliminate the lookup tables, it probably had 14 tables or something like that to make a ceramics database. Does that sound about right, Penny?
Yeah, I agree.
So, and one of the things that we're trying to do with our, with our software is that, that you don't have to know all the details of what's going on in the background. You don't generally have to write your own SQL. You don't have to do these. Right now, we do some of it automatically, and we do the rest of it by hand. And and over time, the amount that we have to do by hand is going down, and the amount that it does automatically is going up. So I've gone into maybe a little bit more detail than is absolutely necessary but this is a way of thinking that when you've got your record sheet in front of you, and I often tell people, a record sheet and a report are really good, so we see how you're collecting data and how you're actually using it in the end. How to look at that record sheet and think about the ways you break things up. But I guess I can reassure you that if you do it this way, it's not going to prevent you from using SPSS or R or other other tools like that. And in fact, I think in the medium to long run, it makes your life easier because you don't actually, again, have to go in. And I know I had to do this in these spreadsheets I did for workload because, okay, the head of school and the dean want all these reports then on how many face-to-face hours people have, how many face-to-face hours do people who don't have SSP, teach, what's their teaching workload, their service workload, their research, workload, and they're all, and then they want it by discipline, and when I wanted to do that, if you're making charts in Excel, the chart is ordered by the order that the items are in. So if I've got a teaching, a research, and a service workload for all the staff, I had to copy that data into 3 different places, order it in different ways, and then make the charts based on it. That often there's a lot of what you were saying about you end up copying data and then deleting columns or sorting it differently and doing things like that, and you do that across a bunch of copies. And so then when census date comes around and we find out what the real enrollments and courses are, and we enter all the real enrollments and courses, and everyone's teaching workload changes, then I've got to do that all over again. And if you've got stuff in a database, you don't, because the data's only in one place, you haven't copied and pasted anything anywhere. You can reorder things on the fly however you want. You can query the data in many different ways, all at the same time. I can sort it by, I can have 3 queries, and I can sort it by teaching workload, research workload, service workload, face-to-face teaching. I can just write slightly different queries that do all of those things simultaneously and produce different data sets. There's actually much more that you can do with the data with much less work. If you've got it in this structure. And the trade-off is really comes down to how big is your data set. That there will be there's a threshold. Well, how big is your data set? How complex is your data set? And there'll be thresholds. And yes, there are. I imagine that any archaeological project I'm ever on, we're still going to use Excel spreadsheets for something. I'm pretty sure that that'll be the case. That there are things that spreadsheets are good for. There are things that FileMaker access type databases are good for, and I don't want to. I think that often that is an improvement over the Excel spreadsheets. Or as we went to a talk with one of my colleagues not long ago, who's an archaeologist. I hope that's not too much information, so that you can figure out who she is. She's great. We really like working with her. But Brian was there at the talk. And and she presented this data that she had, and she presented this story based on the data. And she's really good at telling these stories. And Brian's like, "Wow, do you have that data? There's all sorts of different things that we could do with it." And she's like, "Well, it's in a table in a Word document, And we're like, we're going to, I think, be working with her in future to help her with doing more with her, with her data, going to an Excel sheet, a spreadsheet is probably better than putting it in a table in a Word document. Going to FileMaker Pro or to Access is, in many cases, an improvement over keeping it in an Excel spreadsheet.
And going back to what you said earlier on, though, I think going back to right at the start, there's the data integrity and precision issue as well, and or accuracy. It's so easy to screw up Excel spreadsheets. But the relational database is there. It's confining its searches and its formula, everything, the stuff that's in that table. The query is separated from it, so it becomes much more difficult to bugger up your analysis. Well, I mean, you can. Interpret that analysis is one thing, but if you're doing basic things like formulae and calculations, stuff like that, it's pretty hard to do. Unless the original data is knackered.
And increasingly, statistical software packages they expect to work with data in relational databases, and they're getting more and more closely integrated with it. And the same is true of GIS. That up through ArcGIS, up until 9.3. Esri had their own sort of polite way of putting this suboptimal data storage engine that was sitting behind ArcGIS. And at 9.3, they finally threw in the towel and said, "Forget it. We need a real database as our backend." And they started using Microsoft SQL Server as the backend for Esri ArcGIS. So you can actually, there are still complications of getting all of your data structured the way that you want and doing it and then using that data in ArcGIS. I think ArcGIS, the barriers of getting your data right are still too high in ArcGIS. That's probably one of my biggest criticisms of it, that it's so much easier to use flat data in one giant, spreadsheet-like table in ArcGIS. That I mean, when I've been going to the AAA, the European Association of Archaeologists, the American AIA, Archaeological Institute of America meetings, I don't think I've ever seen an ArcGIS paper that actually uses relational data. They always smash it down into a flat table before they do their analysis on it. But in theory, you should be able, and part of that's the habits that people form before ArcGIS 9.3, and part of it is the complexity of ArcGIS. It's the complexity required to properly analyze and visualize data that's in a relational format, but you can do it. We're looking more and more, and this is what the people in surveying spatial engineering at UNSW, often work in, that databases, like whether they're commercial databases like SQL Server, or open source databases like SQLite, the database we use on the Androids, or Postgres, which is a heavy-duty enterprise class relational database, but an open source one. They all have spatial extensions now, and many of them have statistical extensions where you have essentially plugins to the database. In the case of SQLite, it's called SpatialLite. It's PostGIS for Postgres. It's built into SQL Server, has geometric and geographic data types now. That they're building in these, and that's for spatial stuff, and for statistics. R, the open source competitor to SPSS, plugs into Postgres pretty well. And I've seen, not in archaeology, but in other disciplines, very sophisticated geospatial statistics by taking Postgres, plugging in PostGIS, plugging in R, and doing statistical geospatial queries. They do some really interesting stuff, mostly in other fields. And in the long term, we'd like to help build those kinds of tools for archaeologists to use too, where we do the putting together these things, and then a relational database, a GIS, and a statistical package, and then just putting it up online as a service for archaeologists. I mean, that's sort of a longer-term goal of our project. This is, again, something where the linguists are a little ahead of us. They've done something like that for linguistic analysis, where you can go to a website, point at the corpora that you want to analyze, and then select the types of analysis you want to do. I want to, they tokenize it. They break it all up into a giant database of words, and then they, go through, and then they do, frequency analysis, and then they do, there are things that linguists do to corpora when they're doing computers detect corpus analysis, and there's recently been a project in Australia where they've done this and made a relatively straightforward, easy to use sort of online service that you can go to, use existing corpora or plug in your own corpora, and then run series. Choose what analyses you want to run on it, in what order, and the heavy lifting of writing the SQL and all that stuff is done. It's done for you. So that's looking forward. There's a lot of potential this way, and there's a lot more potential for data to have an afterlife and be subjected to all of this kind of thing if we can get it into good, get it to be what they call well-formed data that conforms to some of these guidelines that I've been talking about. I don't know. I think this stuff, everybody else thinks this stuff boring, and I like it though. It's like putting a puzzle together in a way. I mean, it's one of the. I find it actually uses some of the same, ways of thinking that attracted me to archaeology initially, like especially prehistoric, early historic archaeology in Europe, where there are lots of pieces missing, and you have to put the puzzle together anyway. There's a lot. There's similar ways of habits of thought that go into designing databases like this that I don't know. I don't mind.
No, but it's really important stuff, though. If you get this wrong, then all your data search and analysis, everything becomes horribly complicated, inaccurate, just problematical. I mean, we don't have time to spend endlessly searching through and fixing problems that have been caused because we haven't got off our asses and got our data ironed out. And
it makes it difficult for you to answer your own questions, and it makes it impossible for other people to come in. And ultimately, what we'd like to get to the point where, as archaeologists, we produce data sets where we do our own analyses on them, and we publish our papers, and we do our thing, right? But then the data sets are released out there, and other people can ask questions of that data that we didn't think of at first. That's like the ultimate goal, the repurposing of data. this is in, if you look up some of the journal articles by, say, Eric Hansa, who does this open context project, he shows how much more impact there have been of certain scientific studies over the last 100 years have ended up being of much greater impact than you might think they were, because the data was all fully published, and the data had been structured and organized in a way that let you ask new questions of that data. The data, I mean, yes, when we design a module for you, we want to see what your research question is. We want to see what kind of reports you need. We want to make sure that you can answer the questions of your data that you want to answer in your data. But the next step beyond that is also trying to structure your data in such a way that new questions that you didn't think of could be asked of it. And you know, although maybe it's not a total sort of one-to-one relationship, the way to do that is often to try to get your data into as good a format as you can, you know, this way. And another thing I'd add on top of that is trying in some way to separate things that are, I mean, if there's, you know, if there are any post-processional archaeologists in here, you can argue with me about this, but I think that there's a certain amount of common sense. Things that are a relatively objective observation about what you're working with. You know, how big are the inclusions and what color are they? Okay, the color thing we might argue about a little bit, but you know, things that are relatively objective pieces of data, and things of your interpretation, like what's the provenience and the date of something. That's more of an you know. It's much more likely that data is going to change from new discoveries than that the size of your inclusions is going to change. You know, that some awareness of what, you know, what is an interpretation, and I'll give you an example of this from ceramics again. If somebody just gives me the date for the ceramics, or the place of origin of the ceramics, but they don't include the information in the database that was based on, like, is it based on the shape? Is it based on, you know, on the fabric? Was, you know, was there a stamp on the amphora handle that, you know, that's clearly from Chios, or, you know, something? You know, what's the, you know, what was that actually, you know, based on? If they don't, if that underlying data, the decision about dating, you know, it was based on, isn't in there, I can't reinterpret the date of that piece later, you know, and or the place of origin of the piece later. So we've got to think about what is, you know, what's something that that's essentially an interpretation that may change as more, you know, as more data comes to light, more information comes to light, and what sort of intrinsic, like, keeping that in mind is often, you know, is often a good idea to make sure that the data is useful to other people later as well as to you now. And I fully recognize that, you know, doing your own analysis is the most important thing. We want to make sure that you can do that, but then this is sort of the additional, you know, thing that can add to your research. It can add to the research impact, and is more as a contribution to the sort of greater world of research if we can do that. Yeah.
So when you're initially doing data, a data set, can you go straight into SQL Server and do it on there, or is it best? Can you do it in Excel and then in several files and then export into SQL Server?
You could import data from Excel into, and often what happens is that if you make each one of these things a separate table in Excel, you can then import it into most database. It starts getting harder if you've got them all. If you've got it all in one giant table, it starts getting harder. Is it easier then
can you just put it directly into SQL Server?
Yeah, you can use, for instance, for SQL Server, SQL Server Manager, which lets you create tables, link tables to one another, put your data into tables. One of the things they taught me when I was doing database classes is never let anybody play in your tables. Like, you want all data to go in through forms that can control the entry and help reduce errors. You know, that's sort of another. Yes, we've been that great. We you know, flagrantly break that rule on our project, and we play around in the tables, but we try to keep the students out of the tables, you know, as much as we can. It is very easy to do, you know, dramatic damage to your database on if you work in the tables as opposed to in forms that mediate your entry. And this is what. You know, Access does in the form builder. You build the forms based on the you know, on the tables, and yeah, these are all good questions. But you're right. It is. I'm 25 minutes behind now with it. But I'd say talk to us, grab us at lunch or after today. We're going to try to end early today, so and we could talk to you about strategies for this. Other questions about anything with that? Yes, the learning curve, the barriers to entry are a little bit higher to do this, but the ease of use of the data, the things you can do with the data, and the potential reuse and repurposing of the data is much greater later if you put a little bit more investment up front into it. All right. Seeing nothing else, what we wanted to do, we'll take a break for a minute, but I just wanted to, before we do that, I wanted to say that we can be flexible about what we do from here on, for the rest of the day today. At this point and about at this time, when we were at Flinders, we just said, okay, now we're going to work with data modeling. We had a bunch of whiteboards like this. We broke people up. We did, a lithics thing on one whiteboard and something else another whiteboard, and we worked through with groups of people that are actually modeling them. We did also put onto the the schedule for today that I don't know, Andy, Jess, if anybody brought in spreadsheets of data that are messed up, we'll tell you what we would do to change them, and we can demonstrate a couple of tools that you can use to fix screwed up spreadsheets, for instance, and move them towards a better data, so that you might ultimately be able to break them up and put them into that. So, and we're flexible about that. If someone's got some data that we want to look at how you might clean it up, that's fine. If we don't want to do that, we've got other things that we want to do, then I would go straight to working through the Jess's survey module, Andy's sampling module, and we'd see how we'd actually do that over working groups. So think about it. We can decide when we get back, but we should take a break for a few minutes.
No.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Yes.
Necessary. This is kind of it.
It's basically the historic data.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something like that. I mean, 3 might be enough. I mean,
Basically, it's two options. I got the government.
That's something the way it's broken. The data came through, yeah.
That's a good.
Yeah.
The reason I did that one.
Staging ground, and then you access stick with things like doing access, staging, and then just trash and rebuild.
I have done things in Excel already for access, so I just use the wizard. The tables.
Yeah, magic.
And that works, does it? Because I'm going to do that on several tables.
Well, I found sometimes it's
It
very
looks for
good.
repetition, and then cool.
But it identifies primary keys. And it creates the lookup tables.
Yeah. And there's so many easier ways to do lookup tables now. Sort of functionality is built in. You just have the edit button where you used to, if you look up table, you had to create a separate form and a special button. Change things. There's now.
One thing I didn't
So could I have?
But it does all work.
Yes, you can see the things right now.
Because we have this data.
And they're all pre-configured to connect to it, even with the
I
security.
think so, even with the security, I think that
And
if you just do.
Here we are, we've got like 21 sites all across East Africa, we've got all these specialist work. We didn't even have like a database of just some basic field information.
I may go find
And
it.
it was just such a big thing.
Coffee sounds like a good idea.
Hold on.
So we've got a whole bunch of basic
Yeah.
Oh, God, it's just scary.
We just want something to So we just use a simple all data entry form and something separate for us. So something extra, for one for regions, so, but they all link to one like which is organized across the top. And you can change the database. That's a spreadsheet display.
We use different logins. We can't have 15 people all in the same.
And you get cross-tabs.
Yeah, it is fair.
Because I went
And you
downstairs, I
can,
used to do
usually
it,
make it
and
to
somehow the server choked on it and stopped
join.
accepting anything,
Add
because
another
I went downstairs
database
and
to
it didn't work when I
join
was,
based
sometimes
on
it
the other
didn't
in the context.
push something and then everything.
And then you could in this
So-
database, you could say import
We
dates.
need to make people, we need to make student ABCD.
See, that's what I
Issue or
okay, so
whatever,
I've been
and
working on
put, I
a
think
database
we're doing for one of
all the
these
information
pieces,
sites,
and login is that.
landscape site that types
And we could just flag this, that projects don't get cut corners
The
and,
login is not
landforms, substrate geology, water.
I just wanted to ask you
So I
about,
basically get a really nice settlement.
when we experiment.
And we've got everything at the moment is natural.
Scaling just their
Basically,
action of
it's
thing.
what we can all
Yes.
On the recording forms, to make it easy.
But we have the data there, and we can start putting that data into the database. So the question then is,
I had a little drawing.
how long
I
is
apologize.
like, how long is this time frame?
I will go fetch us some
Database,
coffee
I
if you, and
used to
actually, if you want to start people on this one. Andy was suggesting that everybody work on Jess's survey, because he thinks that'll be more immediately accessible to people than the intricacies of their sample processing.
Do you want me to still do open with time or not?
Yeah.
Oh, let's ask if anybody's got ugly data that they want to work over.
Well, I was just going to do a demo to give people a quick idea of what they can do with their own messy data that they're too embarrassed to bring.
Okay, no, that would be great. but
Seems to be a universal feeling.
If people come back before I
Yeah,
make
I'll
the
get-
lines long, just
yeah.
go ahead and start them. I don't need me here for it. Yes, and I'm going to get you a coffee. Double flat white?
Thank you.
Sorry, double latte for you.
Just a question, you got a recording. Subject when we're editing right now, so we actually had a drawing of us, so if we could just colour in the
Yes.
elements that were.
Andy has the site, he's got that.
Something like that, yeah, so you just colour in the bits that are there, so we can instantly see.
So we're not there yet. There is a way of doing that that's called an image map, and I want it not to be
And that's why I was telling Penny to go ahead and
the
start.
bottles, which is so
That
much
way,
more
so that
important.
I can get.
You know,
I'll
the
get
idea
coffee
of,
to
yeah,
you.
of having a bottle, you know, like from the shaft or the glass.
Yeah, the
Glass, yeah. All of those diagrams of portion
Yeah.
profiles where you can just, if there's the picture of the bottle and you've got a rim, neck, shoulder, instead of typing in rim neck, you just go tap, tap, and that's your part of the body, you know, that's the kind of application I want.
Yeah.
And when I ask for it, because it can be done, they're like, oh yeah, that's an image map. So can we have it? No, you can't, that would take months. So, yeah, it's something that could be done. The short-term solution
is to do it outside the app in a sketchbook Pro where you have a standard template and you draw on it. It just would take longer and be fiddly, and I'm not sure what. Yeah, which you'd have to do for sketches of a context anyway. So it's the time, and there's ways of doing it where you move quickly and you have it preloaded, and there are ways of doing it quickly, but it's not as neat as that.
So could you have a button in your form that actually press that button?
Unfortunately not, because we can't call other apps from within inside the app at the moment. That's something that's one of the limitations of Android. Where we call functions like the camera, it's because we're calling a piece of hardware, and you're allowed to do that from inside the world of the app, but you can't call to other apps. So our barcode integration that we're looking at, they're wiring it into the app because you can't see the barcode scan out from within the app. It either has to be part of the keyboard, which is a piece of hardware, or it has to be.
Yeah.
So
Very like that. I wondered if anybody had looked at
and for people wanting to do content sketches.
Oh, that's wonderful. Now it looks like it's all fun. Instead of the intense heads in.
It's a baby, see, they all smile.
She's smiling, that's good.
I don't think I'm
Looking like mum today.
The other solution, you let the body fly now and so much rest. The other way to do it is have paper forms and photographs. So just have a ton of paper forms, quick little, you know. Depending on how you work. I think with detailed sketches, the Samsung Notes are beautiful with the stylus, but I still think I would be faster doing it.
You were just covered with probably.
It's publication ready. If you do it with your stylus, you can have a nice black and white image. It won't be as perfect as doing it with Photo Station or whatever, but you can pop that straight to if you're doing it on paper and photographing, you still need digitization to do it. And it's going to depend on individual people and their workflow. I'm going to set up my computer to work quick
Earlier late. Because there was just a bubble below earlier late. To me, it's such troublesome. Yeah, you know, because you can't like before that little.
Basically, I designed a link pipeline so that we can get as much information as cool people who really going to be able to do stuff.
Yeah, little matrix, yeah, that's good. To me, that's really useful. But that's all about how you excavate it, not necessarily about.
No, this is not
I just combined your it was 105 There were a number of the I'm actually
Links, these are really always.
so that's
always
so
basically builds.
I'm going to talk about it. I've talked to them before 4 or 5 years ago.
One show you a bigger
Talk about that and then the mystery. Start with the mystery.
Well, things like
I was going to give it back there. Create the mystery solving. So I was actually going to leave out a lot of it. One of them, the other.
Pretending to work.
Yeah.
One to it's at one on the bottom, but
It's usually more of a detail. Everybody loved it. Even Andy said it.
unless there's something
That must have been.
So you mean they're powerful?
They're powerful. Local cowboys are
That's where actually
They are.
I dread that. Behind the door.
Who won? Which person?
No, that was a start. I just got the winner. By a long, I was standing 2 feet away from everybody. And then Cashy.
Either or, third option, they take the land table, plug it into the socket, and they will do it for them.
Is this the one that was here?
Because when you upload and download all the images,
No, that's
instantiate project, you've got to upload the images. I know I've done this 17 times in the past week. So it's easier, yeah.
So if they do the whole task.
Yeah, and if we do it and check that everything's working, and then once we're finished,
We'll have Dave do it, because that's exactly what the internet upstream is for.
have we tested that?
I can test it right now,
Dave's ability
I can do
to
it.
take over.
It really works. It usually works this way.
I do like it.
I'm going to ask the IT guy, see if you can.
I don't know if Was you not know this one if we have a thing too?
That might be useful to
Yeah, why didn't, because I think it doesn't need to go through this computer. That is just the,
Yeah, that's what I think.
why is it looking at
I think maybe we have to log in there. I think that's what happened to Sean yesterday.
so it's going to give us a breakdown of time.
We have the broadcasting, should we? No, I guess they have the thing yet.
And we want to
It's just, we only set it all.
Yes. Yes. Good. And nobody's watching.
Yeah.
That's, yes.
Next time.
Oh, it's filming over there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the database,
It's an
making
audio.
sure it's the
No,
database.
it's the audio. There is no audio.
Yeah. I saw it last time on YouTube.
Where's the microphone?
Oh yeah, but there's no microphone today.
There's no microphone today, so.
Eventually, this is probably,
The computer has
to be honest with you,
Yeah.
at some point, this is going to get
Good one.
She saw you've got to be over there.
Oh, when I
Yes,
have
it's quick, yeah. Oh, it's
Sounds in the background.
The guy that we're working with.
Okay. Are you doing a bunch of food?
Oh, wait, hold on, I'm up here.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah, so the.
Great.
Cool, awesome.
Yes.
So yes,
Yeah, we are all set.
surprisingly, it's just that I need to work on the computer and just
So everybody, we're just going to do a quick little demo of Open Refine, which is one of the tools we've talked about for cleaning up messy data. I'm just giving it as a very brief introduction so that you know these tools exist. I'm not doing anything complicated or difficult, but it's a really good tool to play with. And I'm just going to do that for, say, 10 minutes before Sean gets back and we move on to doing some data modelling.
Multitasking.
So, Google Refine, it's an open source piece of software. You can download it for free. Let me just pop back here. Very easy to get. You can create projects just by importing data in many, many different forms. So Excel spreadsheets, CSV files, XML, JSON, various other versions. And you can do a bunch of different filters and different transformations. So this data actually came out of Open Context. It's just a little random bit of data set that I had on my computer, and I actually introduced the errors for the benefit of open context generic answer. I had to add some errors, but there are different ways that you might transform this data anyway. But you can look at each column and do a basic facet, which here on the left is giving you groups of your faceted grouping of your data. So you can see there these two should be the same thing. I'm actually going to transform this one because it will be up. It's difficult being backwards. Top button. So we're going to introduce errors everywhere now. And then that has transformed all instances of that word across the whole data set. So in Excel, you might do this as a Control-H, find and replace. In Access, you might do something similar, or build an update query. In Google, find that sort of transformation is really simple. You can also do transformations and splitting of columns and rows, many of which would violate the rules that Sean was talking about this morning, but I'm going to do it to show you how it can be done. So we've got here linked persons, and there's multiple values in that column. They're individual names that have been separated by a comma. So you can edit the column, split into several columns. Our separator is going to be a space. In this case it's going to be a comma. And we click OK, and it's retained the first name in the original column, and it's put the second name in the next column. So they're just very basic things that you can do in Excel. You would insert a column, copy one column, do a string search, paste. This is just much neater and much faster. There are a whole range of other more complicated transformations you can do if you wish to learn the basic language of finding strings of text and pulling them apart, which I'm not going to go through, but some examples. Well, actually, here's another one where we could transform the column. We're going to use a separator of a space, and we're going to limit it to 2 columns at the most, and click OK, and we then split the term pottery from the actual pottery number, and then we can rename this column pottery and delete the first one. And those sorts of things you can do fairly easily in this product. You can also do it other ways in Excel, but I find it much neater and cleaner to do it this way. And the big job would be this notes field, which, as you can see, has a ton of different attributes in it. There's month cell colours buried in there, there's notes and all sorts of things. You would need to use the scripting language to pull those apart and put them into different columns. Thank you, Auntie, because I'm now finished. Perfect timing.
Great.
Yeah, so that's just a quick demo of how the product works. Yes, just to give you an idea of a few more tools that you can use when you're dealing with messy data.
So you just grab your Excel spreadsheet and bring it in.
That's right. I'll show you how to create a project. We're going to choose a file, and we'll choose Open Context Data. Now, it's assumed that it's a tab delimited file, which it's not. It's comma separated.
Yeah.
So that's transformed it into the column headings that we recognise. You can choose to, ignore the first line if it doesn't have headers, which most data sets you have. There's a bunch of different options. And these are the different file formats that it can import from, there on the left. And that's what we want. So we create our project, you can change the title there. And then start playing. So, yeah, it's all very simple, very easy to use, and a very good product. Okay, so I think this is Jess here.
It's free, is it?
Sorry, it's free, yeah, free. Yeah, Google Open Find and download it. It's actually a little script running like that.
in the background, and then you go to your browser to operate. So it's fully web, it's all web software, but it's very easy. Yeah, very easy. We got using it within about 15 minutes when we first saw it.
And then when you're done, can you just re-export it?
Yes.
Like back into whatever format.
Yes, or transform it into something else. You can transform it into XML or anything else that you need to.
Cool.
So perfect timing. We're going to start doing modelling of Jess's survey sheets.
Ooh.
Yay!
Secret.
So do you want me to talk about what
Yeah,
we're trying to
prep your
accomplish, or are
diaries.
you?
So
Yeah.
we got sidetracked, Jess and I did, talking about using Sketchbook, and I haven't warned her that Andy has said that we can focus on your modeling your surface survey, because it's somewhat more straightforward than Andy's sampling processing, and I think that that more people will be able to relate to it. So
Okay.
But now we're going to spread the joy, spread the fun.
Well, I don't have any pictures. I would have brought in like a picture or something, but if you guys can just visualize, this is going to be a problem that anybody who's on survey is going to encounter. And the way that we're going to start doing some of our surveys, at least in Central Africa, is actually, oddly, it's based on the Code of Practice for Investigation of Archaeological Objects in New South Wales. So it's something that I was using once when I was doing some consultancy work, and I found it to actually be really useful. Because the basic principle, for those of you who don't know it, is you walk along, and you might be in your set spacing, or you might be by yourself, or whatever it is that you've designed in that respect for your coverage. But you essentially walk in transects, and as you proceed, you record the transects not necessarily with respect to point A to point B, but you do it with respect to landform. And so as you walk along flat area, this will be transect 1, start, finish. You walk along, you make your observations as you go. As you go, you have general observations about the transect itself, but you also have specific observations about each object that you find as you travel along that transect. So those are the sorts of data that we will be recording in Central Africa. It's also the sort of data that you're likely to encounter if you're doing survey work and consultancy in New South Wales here. So it's actually quite useful to develop those two in tandem. So you come along, you start at point A, you want a GPS point. You're likely to encounter objects as you go that you want to record. And you start walking. As you walk, you record attributes of your transect between here and the next point. The next point is determined by the landform itself. So it's not determined by some arbitrary point of distance, but as there's a significant change in slope, for example, you transect and you go up, let's say, to the top of the hill. And I could just draw a little picture, actually. This is quite useful. What this does is, as you're walking in a straight line, you're crossing terrain that looks like this, right? And then let's say you've got like a river valley down here, there's some water in it. And if your objective is to understand the distribution of archaeological sites or objects, from here to here, it's actually not that useful for you to take this as one big long transect and then turn your line around and go back the other way, right? Because this isn't dividing it up in a way that's particularly meaningful in terms of both the original distribution of sites, so why it is people are actually choosing to inhabit particular parts of that landscape, but also with respect to the post-depositional movement potential of artifacts. So the burial of sites, the relocation of sites, the exposure of sites, and that sort of thing. And this is also going to speak to the chances that you're actually going to encounter a site or an object as well, right? Because areas that have strong erosion potential are going to reveal sites, but then similarly, they will also end up moving sites. So what you want to do in your transect recording is you want to start here, and then you actually make your transect from here to here. Sorry, from here to here would be number 1, right? From here to here would be number 2. From here to here would be number 3. Right. That. So you're probably getting the sense of how you break up this landscape with respect to topography as the initial one. Go along here. 5, can't count. And then 6, and so on. So that's basically the way that you do it. So you've got let's say 7 different transects along there, and you have an individual description and an individual identifier for each of these transects, even if it's one long, what a lot of archaeologists think of as a transect, i.e. walking from one point to another point. You actually break that up into environmentally and topographically meaningful units, and then you can analyze the distribution of objects with respect to those units. So that's been very handy for us as well in Africa, because we've got a lot of exposed artifacts. You walked across lots of different kinds of geologies, but geologies are also constrained by landform types, because you have little preserved bits and pieces of that ancient landscape that are still there. So the sorts of data we want to collect in this situation are, we need some sort of information about each transect. There are standard things that in New South Wales they record that we've also found useful. That's the percentage of visibility, so what you can actually see on the ground with grass cover and that sort of thing, but also the percentage of exposure, so you make some sort of estimate about the erosion potential of that particular part of the landscape. Then as you go, you also have individual records of artifacts that you want to recover. So you want to know stuff about how many artifacts there are, where they are. It's spatial data, but we have to divide it up into some sort of database forms in our recording. So that's those are the sheets that you have in front of you. That's the sort of stuff we have. Is the attributes of the transects themselves, the attributes of each object that we find along that transect.
Jess, we've got them up on the screens too, I think.
Oh,
I think we have different.
oh, that's that.
Yeah.
We don't use those forms ever.
Oh,
Sorry.
That's an old form. We won't use those as the basis
Sorry.
of the module.
No, that's okay.
I use this for teaching the field school. It's a lot of the same principles, but not as explicitly laid out.
Now, do you have, are all of the pieces you do, are they single find individual artifacts, not, you divide up your sites later, you don't actually do a separate, like, site out in the field, but we can just consider those artifacts?
Not for this particular type of thing we're doing. I do it for teaching, because there'll be some sort of arbitrary thing, like if you find, I think it's we use more than 5 artifacts.
These must be when you can't.
Site, and then that's something like this. But that's more for teaching purposes.
Okay, so for this, it's
the actual research
artifacts.
Yes,
Yes,
or cobble samples, so taking within a square meter of each other, one cobble sample, 10 cobbles within that space.
So should we create groups so that people can work on it as groups
Yes,
and
that's
define how they want their module to look, and then Jessica tells us which group got the closest to her, to her
So-
ideal.
Well, you don't necessarily, so what I think we'll have you do, there are a number of whiteboards around the room, and we'll maybe leave Jess's drawing up so that you can refer back to it, but we'll bring you up in groups so that maybe, 4 or 5 you over there and come over here, and
In a group.
if I can flip this over, maybe. So someone could be here, and what I'd like you to do, and we'll circulate around to help with this, is think about, first the data structure. We talk about the front end and the back end database, right? The data structure itself. Like if you were going to record things, what are we often use these, it's the entities, the things that you want to record. That would be what's at the beginning. Like if you had an Excel spreadsheet, the row is typically the entity that you're recording. What kinds of entities do you want to record, and what kinds of attributes about those entities need to be recorded? So I can you can just sort of draw a box and say that this box represents the entity of whatever, and then write the attributes down, and that. We'll start with that, like what the data would actually look like, which is relatively straightforward on this one. At least it seems like it is to me, but I think it's still worthwhile to walk through that. And then we may then, if that goes okay, we can talk about the interface, which is more about the workflow, like the architecture. So workflow. But let's start with the data. So if we get 4 of you over there, and 4 of you at this whiteboard, and this
So we
one
do
with
collect
your
t-shirts
pens.
of data.
That one's reasonably accessible. We'll leave Jess's sketch up here, and Jess has some forms that she can hand out, and Kitty and Adela and I can and help. I'll let you work on it for a few minutes first. So, go.
So everyone takes on
I'm going to let you work for like 10 minutes on your own, and then we'll come around and continue on until noon. Let's see where we're at noon.
But then if there's 24
So it'll be like that couple sample number.
yeah, couple sample number.
And then within that each of the
Yeah, so that's 3 tiers of reporting. Okay. And they're arbitrarily numbered, the couples, 1 and 10 tiers.
That's right.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter. Do you want to
Sorry to interrupt, but Jessica, are any of these, Adele, I was going to ask if any of the forms that we've got, we can use people to see. No interfaces yet. I don't want nothing with interfaces yet.
I just
I don't want to think about it this way, like as from the interface. Like you are thinking about it yourself, that's what we're doing interfaces.
Well, it's basically separate. Separate payments and
We should be doing whatever, this is
Do you want me to go
yeah, it just keeps, it's just great. More. The transit numbers are these here. Because they're not spaces and that.
So the
but then you've got
multiple tabs. Another thing is remove all flags.
They're all nice. Separating. See the way I used to, I'd call that all trans one.
And we published one paper on this, which has utilities to registry.
on the.
No, I know, yeah,
So
that's,
you know, if we could just have
Yeah,
it.
well, they're still walking in a straight line, but she's gonna up through, well, she's gonna land on right, yeah.
And then,
That's
start, and then, automate the problem.
Yeah.
It might be like,
No, it's not.
We think it's very
Yeah.
good.
Just a human notice.
Yeah, in case you need to stay.
So they're going to be able to search.
You don't need to
No.
number it was.
So there's,
The thing is,
there's
like,
slope, slopes.
Kind of like how when we think about our excavation projects, we think about
The question is, would you have that?
the whole,
You actually have to
nice
separate.
areas where.
Well, no, again,
You key it into that.
they don't like to separate tiles,
there
but it's almost a separate title.
Each one of those is listed.
it's not going together.
Yeah, because
Your idea of
size,
You know, then that would make sense.
How many?
So which comes, which is the
Don't model it ourselves.
You can start this one from scratch. I think we're pretty clean with
Well,
Well, you have to type.
yes,
Which is a really
yeah, yeah.
Yes, but within the survey area, it's only going to be fixed on.
I mean, what happens though when you then take your next pass across the landscape? Is that you've got a large knowledge of.
Well, you have, what you have is a land.
Survey, potential survey.
Have a land type.
Say,
That had your- and that.
say this is a big broad area and you're going to do more than one of these cuts across the landscape. The next time you survey this bit of the landscape 20 metres over or 50 metres over, is this going to be still transit 1 or is this going to be transit 10? And then you're going to marry up 10 and 1
So you have to.
as both being.
And I think they all get different numbers.
No, that's something you want to think about when you set it up, how you're gonna, whether you are.
Well, whether they get different numbers or not, they would still.
By the land, identical, so they can land between certain.
I would actually say that if you put something
That's what
like
we
that
need.
process,
And then I was like, because that transect is less than.
so then you can execute it to the transfer.
Well, then,
Then the transect.
no, so then if you have floodplain, then you've got FP, which is floodplain, so every time your cross-sec transit is on an FP, you then query that data for FP, you come up with transit 1, transit 12, transit 15, these are all. So you see what I'm saying? So this is just a cross section, but if we made this three-dimensional, and my plan was to have people walking every 50 metres across this landform, and the landform's going to change a bit. But say we've already decided we've got flat plain, slope, plateau, whatever. We've got our 9 categories of landform. Three of the main ones. So I always have to pick what transpose one of those 9 categories. But I'm going to end up with lots of survey because they're going to be a sequential number, so that I can always pick up whether it was Jess who surveyed transit 1 or someone else who's, you know what I mean? Like, well, that's the only way I can.
That's survey design.
Yes.
Everybody necessarily.
Yeah.
It's more.
Depends whether you
Doesn't
that work out.
Okay,
Okay, so
What's
of
happening?
my, say I'm doing
It's just that we're
over a
remarks
area.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's just the due one person doing it, so they can be sequential, let the transect is sequential. You can end up with
Yeah.
nine plus
It's
might be 1, 10, 17, and you want to be able to look back, who surveyed it, or where, like, because, like,
Well, it covers the whole
transit
bunch of things.
is also on this.
Yeah,
Like,
It's
here, so it's 50 metres.
Yeah,
away.
it's right.
So that was really different elevations of floodplain to transect 1.
Dangerous relevant to floodplain.
Yes, that's right, so you're gonna wanna be able to pull out that there's a spatial difference this way, despite there being. So that's why you do need to have separate identifiers.
Just don't move it.
Ideas. This is part, this is plans, I'm gonna have 10, many, and that's all gonna be break stroke.
Otherwise,
Like that, and I wanna have 1, 2, 3, 4,
those are the
9, 10. But
Yeah.
this is always.
It's not gonna be a nice.
No, it's not, it's not, and you're gonna be looking at GPS and going, okay, my floodplain is here,
Which is
but over
secondary,
here it
but it's not
is
that long
here.
for the land.
But this is all gonna be FP, floodplain's gonna be my land.
Got your landform, and then you
So,
need on the table.
You need these all of these, this might be 16, this might be 3, but transit 23, 16, 9 and 1 are all floodplains.
Just as
They're all
important
gonna
as
be different lengths, but you're gonna wanna know, spatially they're different. You know what I mean, you're gonna wanna know, oh, there's suddenly, you know, where this floodplain's broader, there's lots of sites, but where it's really narrow. There's
What this is
information in this.
the attributes of the.
As well as that way.
And the spatial information comes from the
Yeah.
So remarks
So
on
you- so-
landform,
so
because their
landform-
landform becomes.
landform
What's
becomes
going on?
Yeah, landform is gonna be like variance. Well, it actually goes up there in an extension. That is for transaction and the spatial extension.
Yeah.
So if we start,
you need to put transit in,
Yeah.
that's how they think.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this
Yes, I think.
how do we, like,
So that just
So it's a key label.
I reckon you want to jot down these.
so you can say, okay.
Or the
so this one's got-
workshop, yeah, so that everyone's.
So we have this set of.
Yeah,
So you-
10 identifiers. 10 land.
So that's very
I mean, I personally always think administrative stuff first, day to day. If we forget about that,
Yeah.
yeah, but is that the workflow?
Yeah, so we can break that landform down, so you can have
To me,
three rounds
that's
of
the
work, so if it's transect.
But it's also-
Those are
pieces of
I
Right
also
now,
think with
since that's more absolute, more details of the range top. Yeah.
Is that-
So it's
No, none of that works.
We don't have that, just.
So we transect one.
But that would be the
So you
workflow.
start.
Spreadsheet. You would have
I mean, I write. Always would have all the day, your initial.
of that land. Degrees of slope, angles,
Yeah,
edges.
so
Yes.
I'm just thinking like the comments, how would you go?
It's still, we're still concerned that we're going to say the transit.
Yeah, I think this is what's going on.
So the transit is starting.
No, no, if you start there, you start GPS point, you know, that's pretty much it's not going to be landfill. So you record the transit.
Yeah. Well, you will have
Then
that
after
getting that point, but your end point.
So, okay, for like,
The end point.
obviously transact one is in arranged top and
Yes.
in randomly arranged top. But then the marks on the range top.
It can't be any time.
Well,
Yeah.
it should be.
So that one is there just to,
No, that's,
So, but that's, you can't have a comment, you need to. So you can have all sizes land. I don't know why. Well, it's basically land type, like full size.
she's going
She's moving. Yes. Yes.
That's what you do before you leave. And then when you are there,
She might have, yeah, her map.
and you start at the end. That's how I was saying.
So, land for market.
Even though.
And then you go. Survey.
Well, again, the administrative is all the stuff that you're writing out.
I think so too.
That's, this is. Yeah, this is what you need. This is the reason we're here.
Well, then you have, well, that's
Well, no, you do. That's why we're designing it.
You have your sites within a certain physical unit.
like visibility. So if you're, so your average percentage of visibility is just that number.
No, you transit things.
And then remarking is all kind of unit.
This is what I'm doing. This is the unit. Yes.
So because those, any,
Which is actually what I'm actually do. I go all the way to the one.
I understand that.
So you say, right, radio.
So what's the first thing that you do?
On your thing.
Yeah, the admin.
And then you next step.
Visibility.
And then what was the first?
There's this list.
So that is workflow. That's what they ask us to get our data.
The workflow is how you record this data.
Yes.
So you find this.
I know that's what's going on. Into those
What do we want to use?
So what would you actually, what would that, if that was? Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's not my question. What's the place that would actually find?
Isn't it? So
So what do you end up with? When it says remarks, your
Your
transit has to be
The
records that you find. So it's going to be transact one,
Yeah.
and then.
Well, that's right, and that would be
Tall grass, transect 1 short grass, transect 2 short grass, transect 2 trees. It's just going to be a long list. Where's the time you pay for it? It's kind of be shown this way instead of just seeing the video.
That would have to be
So what we're talking about now.
It's a survey thing. It's not
whatever else is on grass, and then
Yeah. Relationship between so different things. They're all. I think so too. See what
okay, so we
Got your transects through this land. So if this bit here is very that's from there to there. 10 meters of
Well, actually, that's a project. Malawi area 1. So that's going to be your area for a year project. You know, where you've got admin, you've got project, year in the project, and then an area. You know what I mean? So if this is like a whole square, if this whole square is going to be, she might be calling this area. Well, that's it.
It might be true this.
Yeah, so area M equals your amount.
Yeah, definitely.
Or whatever it is, but you're going to call it area M. You've got a little box of area M.
I think that's actually how I draw it.
Oh, yeah.
that's a repetition.
So I can remember that now. Seems to be functioning, then he can
I think the
you don't have to do it now. I just want to. I don't want to enough time if they have something up. If I can do it, I can see, and I.
You can just different layers that you need.
He doesn't really need it. I see everything that shows up on the map. Once it's finished.
So let's do it. Let's do it. Just pop them in.
Yes, but transects are straight.
What do you want to ask? If you want to ask the mountain, for example, if you're
Because then if you're going to, yeah, where the couple
and
is.
the river there, and whatever, there you need, and the transects are working like that. Yeah. And what she's actually said.
So you have a
Now she's got that.
Yeah, that's three.
Yeah, that's fine. Except that they won't be, they'll only be lines. Because you can only walk. Yes. No, transect is line. It's, I mean, you might say that transect is
meters.
well, probably 5 meters, but I can see 5 meters. Whatever, I mean, maybe if you want 2 meters. Whatever, you will define somewhere that we believe that we can see.
The only thing I want to make us know is that this is, for example, part of land from that is called mountain, right? And the transect that is here is part of something that is called the river, and that is not right? So if you want to ask at the end, how many signs do we have at the slope of the part
I think that's too difficult. And you've already put where areas all of the
16, 24, one word.
So you know what I mean, you'll know that this mountain might be whatever it's called. If you want to talk about Brown Mountain,
Right,
you know what I mean? You capture that.
Oh, should demonstrate.
I'm not sure you're supposed to dismiss, but for your information, take your branch top off. And you only and can you just only goes to the outside.
And then you've got, okay, I'm going to
That's your
so the project allows
So this one here, and you'll should be the same thing. You should pick it up anyway. Well, yeah, we'll work on that. No. This is what it is.
You were making these.
When we ask why you
I didn't like it.
They are. So.
It should just say no.
I'm not sure how long this is.
Yeah, it's automatically done.
Yes, no, I've been taking pictures.
Well, I maybe even had a program.
And or you look at the table you look back.
So what basically you're trying to
You can listen to that.
And so,
For that,
but you definitely want to also get a really good idea.
It would be better. You have your
it's still not what is your when you actually put in that relationship. Yes. And then you want to this is all about.
We have that. So you have
Okay, we're interested. Jess and Penny and I got so into doing the same thing that you did, and we saw you were all working that we let you go longer. But I'd like to go through the groups now and see what you came up with and what problems you ran into. You erased it. No, you're not supposed to erase it. No. Oh, no, but that's what that will be useful as well to see what you're struggling with. And these guys erased it. Let me see what we're doing. What are we doing?
Can we plug it upstream? Oh, upstream.
Okay. Anyway, everybody ran off again before I was able These guys want more time. The in-group Okay, we've been asked for more time for a couple of the groups, so we're going to let you work on your own until lunch, and then after lunch we'll reconvene.
1:30. 1:30 to 1:30 is the lunchtime.
So if you're,
1:30 to 1:30
I
is
would-
lunchtime.
if you guys could do a quick summary of what you came up with, just on one of the, on like that board or something, so that we can see what, and that board's actually easier to see for everyone else than the corner one. That would be really great, so that we can.
Feel free to articulate the challenges you were facing and the arguments you were facing. Because we are trying to demonstrate what sorts of questions we usually have when people sit up for questions to us. So that, and by continuing our shoes, we hope to make more interesting people will understand why are we constantly asking more questions. So, you could do it.
And he's
So I mean,
what's going on here, really?
we just have a local servers
Because we've got to do it on that one, apparently.
Nothing like never thought anything else.
Okay, no problem. We've got one of the tablets then, so it's got this.
Yes.
It's all pretty simple. We need a password for that to connect this one. Basically. The servers on here are right.
That's why I got confused. The background is you just go from and theoretically there will be networks to try to connect it.
Is this the mini PC was on the list?
But this is, we're not using anything else. This is by itself.
Yes, if you don't need anything, and sure you can use something else.
Oh, no, what I was wondering is the tablets are accessing the server.
Now we are on the server, and here are the sample tools that we have downloaded. I'm not going to create any as an application because I'm So that then any pictures of classroom what you say when you stand there and you are at your first which one did you do? Because there are different steps. I think it is in that order.
Variables between X and Y is variable in terms of
Percentage of
yeah. So what I would go
core, if we had to break core down, it's just showing
So we're able to put that percentage will translate
We go through the data as far as we can, also get all the nature of the data, but then we got to a specific point that's where we had to look at use it so you can create a report that.
Is that you can now create if you were just so now you have been created this user that does not mean your identity trickle. You didn't need to add your specific amount you want to see.
I don't want to. I'm going to let you guys. It is an issue with this same issue you're talking about.
It's created how because 750 people are pushing
So we
synchronized at the same time. Everybody's exam creates
Give them an identity to
when we do open I put my sticker
Yeah. So every time it's different. So we can do that. I mean, just think about this operationally. One more people, we'll have 2 people trenches. We can give them each an identity, or can we just have it say code to the That is a good idea, yeah. It's only not a big deal.
But it depends what they so you can just one of the things we'd like to do is make it easy enough.
So basically, that's cost of survey, and that's a low cost enough. Get it to survey.
Record some of these
And
then if you do it, we don't want to slow it down. We don't want to add more. But if we think build it in, so we do that, then the data
yes, that's
I realized yesterday on there's no structure here at all.
no, they
we have to bring the students to
and what we should do for each of these as well, we should make sure that we there's no connections. There will be things like this things could be, you know, this is passwords and stuff like that.
Now, what we want to do is
what are you trying to do? Is try to go
yes, devices that
where I
and one of them is device. Like right now, we still get 4 devices. So and as you go along, you know, this person when they start, the way we do it now, you know, what actually they draw, and we're using our right now for this. But we basically at between, well, that's kind of, so you're going to lower depending on we have made the point to say, you don't just determine your spacing based on whether you think you're going to find anything. It's based strictly on visibility. So on agricultural fields, it's 15 meters, and in pastures where there's camps, or in sort of overgrown pastures where you have no surface visibility, and you're unlikely to see ceramics, and you're only going to see like brickworks and stuff like that, then your spacing is like 30 meters. So it's only rarely do we call it meters, and that would be in like Penumbra around these couple of cities, antique nation cities, and in the sort of what we might call the suburbs of the city, was like closer, because we know absolutely there's lots of stuff there. Yeah, and then this person.
So you're capturing that one line.
And all we assume is that each person is actually examining a 2-meter wide strip in front of them. How much did they examine?
Well, it was always
It's supposed to be 300 meters.
but I'm sure this is a high power.
And so you're going to go outside.
Yes.
And we don't expect them to see everything.
No.
Oh yeah, we'll test
You
it.
only just take
We'll
one
take it.
2 meters.
We'll have this will be we'll take it spot for that.
And then from that,
Oh, yeah.
because I mean, particularly
So, what we'll do is we'll find
and then it's
spot for
totally
it in the middle of
different.
everything.
So do you get
When we go around.
In the survey that I did so far, in our digital record, it's an average for the whole thing, and in our paper record, we've actually pro forma like this.
which each person has, or just the
Well, actually, there's one person who's in ICA and one's the other. So it's using the paper.
you only have one bit of paper.
So the whole thing.
Right.
Unfortunately,
You were saying that if you buy it today,
As long as it's
what is the difference?
This is the finest restaurant. This 25 meters is the finest restaurant. This person is here. And we've actually found these boxes on these fonts. Here, I can get meters more accurately by counting my paces.
Yes.
And, the rest, it's still over 100 meters. We'll correct it on like a couple paces, but you do this.
This one set up, you can do the 100 meters.
Yeah, that's right. See, we're not even
How often it goes to when we can use it?
The application is Android application. So only if you have Android and something but Android
That's where we didn't find that stuff. They said you wanted to go.
unit being Well, I usually use the ballpark.
Well, that it's right outside.
$2 and however.
This would be, it also wants to be a person that can sell from one of us.
Yeah, sorry.
We have a paper record keeper. We have someone who's in charge of samples. We are regulatory. Like everybody pretty much has a separate.
It's a really drawing role, seeing that.
Yeah, that's right.
What is what?
Well, we have data.
The next job I'm working on is somewhere else.
Whatever the guy is there,
Yeah.
I'd like to get some see if you can get the right kind of cable to plug in one of the devices.
That's all right.
What is it?
So you what you're going to
Roll it into a ball. And it's first roll it into a ball and now make it out of it. And does your sausage come? And yes or no, then it gives you the next question. And it steps you through all the questions. And then to the end, says you've got play to play, or whatever it is.
That's and just that'd be great. I mean, I really want to.
No, really, so that's all I'm a bit about
You can, but the way it's going to be many options.
I have had to set up so that
You do not. Yes.
if I've got time to feel a bit
Yes, you just listen to the number of rows. You just get on this page from the browser. The server, so you just open a web browser, understand the guys, then the hash web browser, and you can download the data, you can download the
That's how you get how high the profit was, all these things.
Yes.
And we just did it.
Here's
Our device, we want it to be like 80% faster paper, so that, maybe we can't make
This is the fast one.
but it could be 80% fast, it will
Away
save
from
you
this.
enough time.
If you
not having to
want
type
well, that's exactly right. And at the moment, I'm still. There's a few different tasks.
okay. So if you want to find the internet,
I am, and they can.
but you don't put it here, you put it in the
And then also when you do that
But
show up.
sometimes, and then I use paper.
Basically what I'm going to say is, what is the best way? And it's what we found.
the best way is
In
plan table.
Exactly. I'm still not going to count 3 hours. But, yeah, I've got 3 days in the field.
It's all right.
I'm going to say half a day, and I can get what you said there.
Yes.
And then what we did,
Well, the thing is,
field in 2 days, you know, on, we want to get to the point where maybe we can half days in the field, but then there's only half a day of volunteer, say a day, and in the end we come out.
So, yes, you don't tell them. It's why we should just tell them to use it, open it for
And it's just one of those things, I'm
Yes, yes, we did it try
There'll be some kind of backup procedure, just plug it in and just get it straight up.
For us, we'll have the last day it either happens the first day of field when you're not ready, or it's the last day of field when you're
don't have time to do
I know what I want to
Okay, yes, make sure you basically you're saying connect up and we'll go through it. Exactly. Okay, it's lunchtime for anyone who wants to quit.
I mean, this is all envisioned to be connected, put away, and everything was and again, they will provide
But it's all working.
It's all working. Even there is even a password.
Yeah, well, it's written on that. Yeah, we'll work that out eventually.
Sorry to interrupt. 1:30. If we could come back at 1:30, that would be great.
Well, yeah, I hope so. We'll see.
When's the work together?
We'll see in the field. I mean, that's going to be the test, but I think that this bit looks like it all works. It's probably going to be more the local issues of.
Just we need in the documentation like how to use that.
Yeah.
Use a login, how they can use.
I'm waiting for Dave to send that information. You just don't look at what he has. But I'll go through it and get it, just to make sure that there is that level. So I'm with this way. We know how to make sure everything's working, how to log in, there we go.
We can spend some more time on it this afternoon because another thing I want to do while you've got this up is I want to connect to it with a laptop, and so that we because that I mean you can connect to it. Yeah, we could do that. I just want to connect to it with a laptop so you can see that you've got the server up, you've got the things like the version. You can do it on a device, but if you've got the bigger screen, a laptop with a bigger screen, that's difficult. So we'll make sure that we can connect the laptop.
It's going to be those things we've just gone through with the demo, the three things about just knowing how to log into the server, knowing about the endurance play, you get those at running from. Just making sure that
and we want to
all we have is we'll just have a particularly on there. That's it. There's going to be nothing else on there.
Right. And what we want to do is make sure that you have all of that stuff set before you leave Australia. It's, again, we're in the same time zone, and you've got good internet, and we want to make sure that the apps are on all the devices.
To be honest, if the truck doesn't wipe it out, it is very good.
Yeah.
Still want someone.
So there's all that kind of stuff. So we're actually supporting
Yeah,
Anyway, right, I'm going to.
Yeah. Is everybody getting marked?
Yeah.
What it is. So we've already got the photos separate.
So although it would be useful to know, we all know that it would be useful to what way to
I would have a photo of it. Maybe.
okay, what is
Did you finish it all?
and then maybe some marking.
And well,
Something like that.
yeah.
Now you have a photo of you levels and
Yeah.
you have four with all in the same color. So now if you want to search for, all your kind of for
So what else do you want to know about?
So that's all.
Yeah. But see, the thing is, it'll all be in like.
What about trends?
See, I think students at meetings.
Well, it's a visual.
I read all that. You know what? I'm so fun. They have
currently, I have it as a but there's not necessarily.
So I actually upload all of their set videos.
I
used to just run recommend.
That's what we ended up doing up there, is pulling out, so we're actually going to change our translation.
Because I was picking up things
So
that
that you
they
change translation.
more
Between what we changes.
Or
but turning something about, I don't know if it's.
And then that way you know what's like they've got a little thing.
And you get
So
something on that.
that if you've got, one lap on side goes on here. And you can.
well, we're finding that even further.
Is that okay?
Obviously, the research that information is so vital that it's not worth doing. To me, that's. Yes. Which then would mean that what you do is wouldn't it, I mean, she's going to separate it there.
Okay, that's.
But basically, it's the same landform divided on geomorphology. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's in the subgroup. So that makes landform sit right. All of this brain. My brain's just going. Yeah.
Carol, what are you doing?
Anything to go down to June or something?
Alright, you want to grab something together? Because I don't have lunch with you today.
So.
Oh, okay.
Just completely came out.
Are you doing something now?
I'm just trying to look up this symptomology.
Some estimate on what you were walking across, and I'm like, I don't know, so I just called it bare bedrock, illegal plane, surely.
The first half of
Is it mostly the city?
Now we're gonna divide it up.
You get where's the city coming What do you think they use?
It looks like that, but deposition on erosion, they say it's kind of like, that looks like it's, it sounds like it's use it air or it's fine. Something that's really, what do you see?
Housing.
yeah, that's
Yes.
Resize it.
Well, and then also attributes.
94%.
So you guys said they're based on doing.
We don't know.
No, I don't need it anymore.
Yeah.
And then we've got actual, like funds that we get on the bedrock, and then like funds that look like this thing and not.
Okay, so also
Yeah. So it's complex, and probably come up with a way to make it descriptive. He would search rather than search, and then there's that would be brilliant.
So the first thing you're going to want to do is spread this out and use those four boxes.
It's, I think probably useful for everybody.
What's on the list at the moment?
Any number of things on the report that, any kind of.
Yeah, it's just select ones that are on the way.
Yeah. Yeah, because that'll be your unit, if you break them up, you'll never see them. Yeah.
Say the tree and we did. And they have time in it.
Oh, my God, I've been always unknown and about to explode with me, so that's a good exploit. I'm exploring about that.
Certain amount of structure data, you can't just have narrative.
It's likely to be your place for bacteria.
We approach on here.
Yeah, it's very cute.
A quick demo, that's great.
Oh,
Should we go eat?
No, this
Oh,
is
yeah, no,
great. This is much more than I was expecting.
So the homepage, basically, was going to get us, there's a lot more to be done, but it says, look, Queensland, Victoria, and this is where we want to do some more work on. We can send you a link, but I was going to give you guys feedback. But Dave has also been on that work, so then this is the and once we've worked to a state where we think it's not bad, then we can develop.
Yeah, I'd like to get New South Wales, and I think that now that you've got Victoria, Queensland on there, that they, and they can see how it is, so that we might very well get them. The other thing, I'd like to see what Penny says about this, since she's actually a historical archaeologist, but if you don't mind, I'd also like to have Grace Karskens look at it, because it's good to get the feedback of somebody, I mean, because Grace is exactly the sort of person, historian who uses archaeological data. I mean, I'm working with her now, she's pulled up a bunch of, she's gotten from the Park Service a bunch of reports, you know, and I'm helping her with those a little bit, data from them, but she's fits perfectly the profile of a researcher who would be using this. And I would really want to talk to people who would be using it. And he would be using the first point of contact, but then I'd also like you to Grace.
It's only in the design stage.
Is quite good at digital stuff and will be quite, you know, she'll work with whatever you give her, but Grace is not. And she.
Because I must have a map search, initially, I just got your door box.
I'm surprised me.
But it's got a default box there, and then resize and move around the time, and she was talking. So, there's an improvement in
Does also let you search by a place.
So can you search like Victoria or Victoria instead, like if you could just, if you use photograph or use.
Or you can use it by a place.
Yeah,
true.
Because nobody's.
I've never done this in context before, have you?
No.
Oh, excellent.
No, it's good.
So the blue is an actual.
Yeah.
There's only two.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we're.
Green is.
Unless you're doing it very complicated.
But I've never done like a picture like except maybe at the time. But I can see them then maybe.
And I think the heritage department well, we've got us ahead.
Right.
Aerials and halves and.
Sure, paths, they dug them into separate.
One of like the fastest stuff. Yeah.
So it's unsimilar, but then when it's not hard,
Fasted search would be great. How far you
There's all the
go.
numbers. Yeah, with the inspiration.
Only some, only the people.
So you can address. Yeah, you can build it by address. Create is just.
And then we technically address all these.
And where there is construction data, we can.
Things like style and building type, we had pulled down in yesterday. Because that's the kind of thing that there's some work to be done. And then another thing is, how do we want this to appear when we're saying something? You know, so is there some, so we don't want to put too much into the style of it. If you've got a particular style, we just want us to put a FAIMS logo at the top.
Penny has got the workshop, she's currently working on styles for the repository. I think it could include a couple icons for the heritage worker. Because we have been making heritage icons and such things.
We should, the other thing is, you know, we're still into problems and delays with RCs now on P3s on the TR implementation. So that's all been delayed. That's the cost rate. It's all been delayed. And then initially it was agreed that they would produce a free production, public-facing production one, and we just had to scale it back to a limited internal release. That's not ready yet, and then wash your hands of it now.
Helping minds use the time of
It's the,
No, Harry.
a little bit. That's what I'm going to say, but what's his book?
What is it if you use every third week?
Much of the project.
Okay, every check.
That's how, that was how.
That's
So
how
we didn't want to do a lot of practice tutorials,
I didn't have an issue
Very
with
talented, I know.
second years.
But he.
I could understand second year.
It wasn't.
Good luck. See something?
Manager.
Yeah, but movies are
They are, yeah. With the Hobbit part is starting later, and animation the little guys fighting those big animals.
And then they have a bad luck of Ahab, with the predecessor of TR, having been sacked, so they had
present
to
a paper and talk.
be working on that instead of working on our development. It was just a cascading.
The Ahab,
Sorry.
it was an online.
Okay, so
Some crawler found, Chinese crawler found and uploaded, started using to upload videos to, pirated videos to, that sort of thing. You know, and so the troll, there was some.
It was FAIMS, did you get an research tool?
We got an e-research tool and we used it with Intersect, the biggest single chunk of money. They Intersect to develop local stuff, and they did great work. We have no complaints.
That's what we are doing here, and it's fantastic.
So they were very good with their scope. This is how long it's going to take. This is what we can reasonably do. You know, we work out the details and there's sprint planning. You know, No, we were, it's very happy with Intersect. So the second biggest chunk of money went to Versi to take.
So you said following what I'm saying,
Versi University had taken the.
So whenever you want to change field structures, you go to create.
If you want to do the United States open source project, they've done an Australian implementation of TDAR and its the Australian Historical Archaeology Database. And you know, they've been working with it for 18 months. So when they scoped it and said, well, for the $100,000 that we're, you know, coming here, they said, we'll be able to accomplish X, Y, and Z. And we thought, we've been working with this software for 18 months, you know what you're talking about. So we said, okay. And they were off by like 80, you know, they got 30% in the end. The scoping was just, you know.
Completely off the mark, and the thing is, still in July last year, they were discovering things that were impossible in the underlying software. Straightforward, impossible. And you know, in December they said, "Oh, sure, we can, you know, we'll try to do this." Well, you know, then the original developer of TDR, who's been on our steering committee and who was saying, you know, this will be very difficult. But I mean, he thinks he could have done it, perhaps, you know, maybe. Yeah. But
Americans who promote their products, and it works fine in their environment and what they're doing. And then they promote it so other people start to internationally, a lot of challenges.
Yeah. I would say that Adam was not particularly, he knew I've looked back through the documentation and he did put caveats in our table. And I look at it now, you know, in retrospect, I see, yes, Adam saw the difficulties. Yeah. Versi did not even pick up or.
And then even, you know, and then there was a lengthy elaboration phase of our project where they had another 6 months about to you know, do some more, and they were still, I mean, I understand that the underlying software is, I think if you make it, it's designed in the early 2000s, and it wasn't designed for sort of online, for cloud-based deployments. It's designed for, it's going to live on a single server, and it was also developed to address problems that I think have been largely addressed by now, the infrastructure things. So like he was really worried about, you know, data corruption over time. So instead, we're going to like make multiple copies of our data and check them against one another, and what is it? And yeah, and it goes with small years. You can't assign a DOI to a record in a table because the table gets rebuilt every 3 months or something, you know, and disappears, and a new table is brought, you know, and so we have to.
And I mean, on that case, if you have as one of your, because Versi was supposed to deliver 12 features in 3 different, you know, releases. And this was one of the features. If you have 12 features,
We now wonder why did nobody look into this record level view-wise. Why was that not? Because we are not unreasonable, like Intersect very clearly at the beginning said, you want meshing, it's probably impossible. So once they said that, we said, okay, forget it, we want something that we can achieve. We want to have realistic goals, but worse never, like we would send our request in and no feedback would come back. So that's where I found management very difficult. And so that was unfortunate, but we learned our lessons. They are using, it's I think they're using Postgres database as one of the three databases, because they have a file server, Postgres database, they have, and there is something else. I can send you the spec, but I remember the
I'm busy doing this stuff. Actual people from UQ who manage this lab aren't here. That's right. But I know they want. Yes, indeed. It looks like Andy unplugged something in order to test the upstream port. This is a kit field equipment that they're going to use in Turkey, and we were just testing this here. And it's got some remote management capabilities, and so we were just testing the upstream port. But it does look like, I don't know why. It does look like he unplugged something and plugged it into here. So if you want to plug it back in where it's supposed to go, I'll tell them not to do it again when they come back.
Yeah, I mean, if there's other cool mechanisms, because the one they're using is configured for the lecture recording stuff.
Okay.
So, I mean, it might work with that, but it's definitely not supposed to be connected.
Why don't you put back where it's supposed to be, and I will let Andy.
If he wants us to set up another network download for use with that, then by all means give us a call and do that.
I will let you do that. He was complaining about something else, that it wasn't working right or something, and it's probably because he's connected it to upstream stuff that's designed for something besides what he's doing with it. So, sure, sorry about that. I'll let Andy know not to fiddle with your gear. So.
My problem with VR is that it basically is very stuck in terms of displaying the data that you have visualized. You can. I always thought that it was database, therefore you write a query and you see your data as you see it. That's not how it works.
It's very difficult to query because of all of this built-in. It's copying these tables around and checking the data against one another, and it's not stable. Like the UUIDs for the rows change because it generates a new table and copies the data into that.
I don't even know where to.
They've got a bunch of
It's this, yes, this is totally.
using
not anymore.
I suspect they've just plugged it into the wrong port. So the guy who actually unplugged it isn't here in my room.
They should have told us, but also last week just we tried to be very supportive to say we've been from August until August, I've been trying to say
I think it's plugged in, but there's 6 possible outlets. And so I plugged it into one, so you can unshut it and see if it.
And we didn't get the
shut off the video recording.
They insisted that they will maintain the repository this year. And in the end, we have a pro forma maintenance contract